Hello and welcome to Represent NYC. I'm Ben Max, your host and the editor of Gotham Gazette. For the first time in citywide elections, New Yorkers will be using ranked choice voting for the party primaries in June. Today's show is about this new system of voting, which only applies to party primaries and special elections. Ranked choice voting is also known as instant runoff voting, and it allows voters to rank up to 5 candidates in order of preference. There's a lot more to it than that, and we'll get into all the details in just a few moments with 3 expert guests. This show is to prepare you to vote in the city's June party primaries and use ranked choice voting as you'd like to. A word of caution though, there's a crowded and competitive race for Manhattan District Attorney, as well as some other races on some ballots that won't be using ranked choice voting because they're not technically New York City government positions. But for most of the races on your ballot in June, for most voters, you will have the chance to utilize ranked choice voting. Those elections are taking place through absentee balloting, and you can request an absentee ballot right now, or through early voting June 12th through 20th, and primary day itself is June 22nd. So let's discuss ranked choice voting. Join me to break it all down, how ranked choice voting works, what to watch for when you go to vote, some of the highlights, some of the pitfalls, some of the questions, the political considerations, and some of the unknowns as we use this system for the first time are Allie Swatek, the Director of Policy and Research at the New York City Campaign Finance Board, Brigid Bergin, Politics Correspondent for WNYC Radio and Gothamist, and Jeff Mays, Politics Reporter for the New York Times. Thank you all for being here. So Allie, you are tasked with doing a lot of the education around ranked choice voting. Can you give us an initial primer on how the voting process works?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. So ranked choice voting is a new way for New York City voters to elect their local representatives. You covered pretty much all of the top line. You can rank up to 5 candidates in order of preference instead of choosing just one. We're only going to be using ranked choice voting in the primaries for those 5 city offices that you mentioned: mayor, public advocate, comptroller, borough president, and city council. But we won't be using it to elect county, state, or federal races. And you mentioned district attorney in Manhattan. That will still be single choice. So ranked choice voting is, of course, only used for special and primary elections. In the general in November, we won't be using ranked choice voting. And it's a lot simpler than most people think. So I don't want to intimidate everyone when I talk about this. Like, we haven't used ranked choice voting yet. This is our first year using it. But most voters find it pretty intuitive once they do actually end up voting it. But the way to fill out your ballot is very simple. You choose your first favorite candidate as rank 1, your second favorite candidate as rank 2, your third favorite candidate as rank 3. If you don't have a fourth or fifth favorite candidate, it's okay. You can rank up to 5, but you don't have to rank 5. So we know
You can
there's a
even
lot
do
of people.
one. You can even do just one if you want.
Exactly. So we know there's a lot of people running for mayor right now. If you only have strong feelings about one candidate, the way to fill out your ballot is to just rank them as number 1 and leave your ranks for 2, 3, 4, and 5 blank. And that's just one example of how to correctly fill out your ballot.
Now, Bridget and Jeff, I want to turn to you with any thoughts on sort of the initial voting process, and we'll get into some political strategy later, and we'll get into how the votes are tabulated in a minute. But just on voting, generally speaking, we don't want to ever tell people what to do with their ballot, but we don't, people should know that if they only rank one candidate, that they might not get a second chance to weigh in when that candidate is eliminated when we get to the counting process. Brigid, what are you thinking about in terms of what people should know about going in and being ready to vote and use their ballot effectively?
Well, I mean, you made that point, Ben. I mean, in ranked choice voting speak, they talk about your ballot being exhausted. And so if you opt to only vote for a single candidate, and that is not the candidate who survives multiple rounds of tallying, well, then your vote will essentially die when the candidate you selected is eliminated from the tallies. If you go back, it's really interesting. I was looking just before we gathered at the ranked choice voting tallies for these recent special elections. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is thus far what we've seen is the candidates that were, the order that the candidates were on, the primary night or the special election night, to be clear, essentially is the order that they were eliminated in all but one case. To be clear, meaning that the first place candidate remained the first place candidate, the last place candidate remained the last place candidate. However, there was one instance in one special election where, because of 2 votes, the order of the candidates flipped. And so a candidate who was not at the bottom was eliminated before a candidate who was. I know that starts to sound complicated.
Right.
However, visually, and I know a lot of people are good visuals help people, absorb some of these concepts. It's really interesting to see these tallies when they are displayed graphically, because then you see how the votes move through the process, and it makes the case for why you should think about, if you have strong feelings about more than one candidate, why it is worth putting more than one candidate on your ballot, because it gives your vote more power. You will, if your first choice is eliminated, then potentially the next candidate that you favor could then pick up your vote if your first candidate is eliminated.
Right, and we'll get into that tallying in just a second. In terms of people going in ready to vote and just fill out their ballot, Jeff, anything else you're thinking about?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have in this race, there are 6, 7 top mayoral candidates that span the ideological spectrum. So, it's very believable that people may have more than one candidate that they're interested in and whose ideas pick their interest. The city is in a difficult spot right now after the pandemic and recovering. So they all have different ideas on how to help the city come back. And, voters may like a piece of this person's campaign, or they may like this person for that reason. So this gives them an opportunity to really have more of an influence in the final winner. And also in the council, as you mentioned, the council seats, all of them are up for election. Some of these races have 6, 7 candidates running.
And more, yeah.
Or more, right? So, if you are the type of voter that has done a deep dive for your local election. I mean, we know local officials are really most voters, first contact for basic things that affect your life very seriously. This will definitely give you a chance to at least go in, research, and have an influence on the ultimate winner. So
right, this gives a lot of incentive for people to really research the candidates and figure out their order, as opposed to just looking around and figuring out who their number one candidate is. They go and they choose that candidate in the past, and that's it. To be clear here, we're mostly talking in this very, very heavily Democratic city. We're talking about a lot of Democratic primaries across the city with lots of candidates on the ballot, which you have this sort of coinciding of many, many candidates running for lots of different seats, as well as the ranked choice voting system that lets voters, rank their preferences. So it's a good confluence in a sense there. There are some Republican primaries. There may even be 1 or 2 primaries for some other smaller parties, but for the most part, Democrats who go into the voting booth or request an absentee ballot are going to have a very long ballot, a very big ballot, and lots of potential choices to make. In each of those offices that represents you, you'll be able to rank up to 5 candidates in each one: mayor, controller, public advocate, borough president, city council. Again, it depends on the individual's district and borough and who's running and which party, of course, but assuming for the many, many Democrats out there, there'll be a very lengthy ballot there. So Allie, talk about the votes and how they're tabulated and what happens next. We've gotten at a little bit of this idea that you want to rank more than one because candidates start to get eliminated.
Yeah, so I think we saw this as well in the 4 special elections that have already used ranked choice voting. We saw 2 or 3 that went through the tabulation process, and 1 which was over in the first round. So the first part of the counting process is all first choice votes for every ballot are counted. If one candidate gets more than 50% of those first choice votes, they win the election outright, because mathematically it's not possible for any other candidate to get a greater percentage of the vote than them. However, if no candidate gets 50% or more of first choice votes, then we enter that ranked choice voting tabulation process. So in each round, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated. They're the losing candidate in that round, if you want to think of it that way. If you voted for that candidate and your top choice on your ballot is with that losing candidate, your vote goes to the next highest choice candidate on your ballot. So this happens for every voter who voted for that candidate. And we repeat the process as we go through the rounds. The next round, the
So
candidate.
let's just pause there for 1 second, just to be clear for everybody. When the first place votes are tabulated, whichever candidate came in last, got the fewest first choice votes, gets eliminated.
Yep.
And the voters that chose that candidate, their second choice gets redistributed.
Yes, their vote moves to their second choice candidate. Talking about it as like the number of choices gets a little more complicated once we move past that second round. Because of course, your second choice candidate could get eliminated in the next round and you could be moving to your third choice, but that's not the case for everyone. So I want to make sure that voters aren't confusing the fact that your vote moves through your ballot from your first choice to your second choice to your third choice. It doesn't necessarily happen in that order in those rounds unless the candidate who your vote is with is eliminated.
So the process continues on
until there are two candidates in the last round. The candidate with the most votes is the winner.
And the counting continues to happen no matter what. We get to, once the ranked choice voting tabulation kicks in, we get to see it all the way through. But once any candidate hits 50% plus one, they're obviously the winner. As you said earlier, it's impossible to catch them at that point.
Yes, the law of percentages says that you cannot have more than
Right,
that
the law
person.
Of a majority.
But we go down to two candidates because if you remember, we're replacing a runoff system, and that kind of more closely replicates the runoff.
Mm-hmm. And Brigid, you've been watching some of the counting happen in these special elections that have happened. Maybe some folks watching this video have had a chance to use ranked choice voting already in the special elections for city council that we've seen that have been alluded to. What have you noticed about that counting mechanics, the counting process? What's been interesting to you there?
Well, what's been happening so far is a manual process. So we wait until the Board of Elections has made a decision to wait until all the ballots are in. And for those there have been some complaints about the amount of time it has taken to get the results. And that is in many ways less connected to how the votes are counted and more attributable to when they start counting them, which is once all the absentee ballots, all the military ballots, and all the potential cures, which is what voters, it's an opportunity afforded to voters to prevent them from being disenfranchised, but it's an opportunity to correct errors on an absentee ballot. If you forgot to sign it, if you forgot to seal it, etc., that we saw last year in particular when we had the primary in the midst of a pandemic, seeing so many voters lose their vote because of these, technical errors. But this new reform builds time into the process. So when we did see them actually begin to count, which in the case of some of these special elections was a 2+ weeks after the evening of that polls closed, they were conducting the count through a manual process using bins labeled with the candidates' names that they would distribute these ballots into once they had gone through this sequence of organizing the ballots and then counting the ballots. And once they finished each round, if a candidate was eliminated, then they would begin the process over again. To imagine that on the scale that we will see voters participating in the June primary is absurd. However, the board, the city and state board are in the process of certifying some software called the Universal Ranked Choice Voting Tabulator, so that when we get to June and when they finally do begin to count these ballots, the process of actually going through the tallies should be virtually instantaneous because it will be a computer that is processing them. I think there are some really valid concerns going up into June about when that process should begin and the extent to which the Board of Elections could begin organizing themselves and the amount of data they release ahead of additional counting. However, the concerns around how long it will actually take when we get to subsequent rounds is probably a little overblown because the software is on track to be available, and that's going to speed things up a lot.
Yeah, that would be a big improvement over hand counting, especially for some of these races coming up. And so you get at a key point that voters and others who are watching closely should not be necessarily expecting results on primary night, and we don't know exactly when they're after, right, Jeff? I mean, this is going to get pretty interesting. Your thoughts on the counting process? Anything we left out there that you're thinking about?
No, I think Brigid hit some really important points. I think that, there's going to be some adjustment for the voters to get used to the idea that they may not know who won on election night. The other thing is, I believe it's possible for whoever wins that first count may not be the person that wins the final count as well. So I think that's something that voters are going to have to become acclimated to. It's going to be up to the Board of Elections to just really be transparent and explain this process to voters about what's happening, and to sort of get that software in place so that, results can be achieved as quickly as possible. Initially, when ranked choice voting started, there was a lawsuit that, made some allegations that, voters hadn't been educated enough. They were concerned of whether people would understand the process. So I think that's a fear that has to be addressed as we move towards actually, doing this process. I think we've been lucky so far. We've seen in some of the special elections, one election you didn't need it, but in some of the other elections, it has taken a few weeks to come up with the results. So I think that's something that voters need to be prepared for and to have explained to them about what's happening during that period.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'm glad you raised it in terms of the fact that not only should voters be ready to not have the results that quickly, but also there is this chance with ranked choice voting, and most of the time it doesn't occur this way, but there is the chance that the person that got the most, the candidate that got the most first place votes doesn't wind up winning the election. I think the research shows in other places that most of the time that candidate does, and we've seen that in these initial special elections, but there very much is a chance that voters' second, third, fourth choices, can wind up lifting someone else as the instant runoff tally goes on. Let's come back in a minute to the education efforts, because Jeff, I think that's also a really key point here, and folks should know what's happening around that. And Allie will outline some of that for us. But Allie, in terms of the mechanics, anything else you want to mention in terms of the voting process, the counting process, to make sure that everybody really knows how this whole thing unfolds?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, Brigid brought up a great point about absentee ballots. If you're planning on voting by absentee, you should request your absentee ballot right now. I think if the Board of Elections does end up changing the way that they do the counting process, it would be hugely beneficial to return your ballot as soon as possible so that they have it and they can open it quicker potentially, and reduce the amount of time that it takes to go through the counting process for that reason. The second thing that I'll mention is that there is a ballot marking error, which is a little more, which happens more frequently in ranked choice voting elections than it does single choice elections. And it's called overvoting. It's when a voter votes for more than one candidate for one rank. So in the grid ballot, you would be marking 2 candidates in column 1. And essentially what you're telling the ballot is that you're voting for 2 people at once, which you can't do that. That's, it's not compatible with how we work through votes. This is something that we've been telling folks who especially are going to be voting by absentee, because if you're voting in person, you put your ballot that's mismarked with an overvote into the ballot scanner, it'll actually be rejected, which is great. And then there's a poll worker there who can help you get a new ballot, and you can fill out a brand new ballot and correctly vote. But if you're voting by absentee, as we know, you don't feed your ballot into the ballot scanner. And so this is just something that in particular absentee voters should be aware of. Do not fill in ovals for more than one candidate in each column. You're supposed to fill in one oval.
The ballots are fairly self-explanatory, but people should be careful as they fill them out, especially for the first time, to really make sure that they're choosing, their top candidate under number 1 and so forth, and not, mistakenly putting multiple candidates, under as a number 1 choice.
I think also we spoke about this a little earlier, just if you have candidates in mind who are your favorite, but there's candidates who you don't like, do not vote for candidates that you don't like. Don't rank them for even fourth or fifth. And this sounds intuitive, but I say it a lot. If you hate a candidate, do not rank them.
Because
First,
your vote could
second,
wind up helping them is the
exactly. If your first, second, or third choices are eliminated, your vote could end up with your fourth or fifth choice. And so you could actually help elect that person. So do not vote for people you don't like.
Okay. And in terms of where we were discussing the sort of process of elimination, is there a way for voters to be thinking about how, how ranking a fourth choice, even if they don't know the candidates that well, but it might wind up impacting the election?
So I think one of the cool things about ranked choice voting, when I learned about it, I thought this was cool at least. There's been situations I think where all of us have gone into the polling place and we've thought, I really like this candidate, but I don't think they're going to win. And so I'm going to vote for the person that I think is more likely to win because there's another candidate I really hate, or I want to make sure that they have like the greatest mandate, or people like voting for people who win. It's an actual proven fact. So the cool thing about ranked choice voting is you can rank the person who you really like the most for first, and the person who you like, but you don't like them as much as your first choice, and you think it's more likely they'll win, second, to keep your ballot alive, to make sure that your vote moves through each of your choices and you can actually contribute to electing the winner. And there's studies that have shown that people feel good about that, which is nice.
Jeff, what's your sense of how well voters know about ranked choice voting and how well the campaigns are doing about working that into their messaging? You especially follow and cover the mayoral race, of course. So, if that's your lens, that's totally fine. And obviously voters are getting a sense that big ticket race is on the ballot this year with all these others. But what's your sense of both voters and the campaigns?
Yeah, I get a sense that campaigns are definitely, especially candidates who think that ranked choice voting is going to help them. They are out doing voter education. I talked to one candidate recently. They talked about how they have plans to do sort of voter education by partnering with city council candidate. One mayoral candidate wants to partner with other city council candidates to sort of do voter education as well. So there are efforts underway to help people understand this process. And, in many ways it behooves certain candidates to, be out there and be a voice for people, to explain the process to them and to, help them get more involved.
And Brigid, what's your sense at this point?
Two things. One, the extent to which some of the traditional influencers in citywide elections, mayoral elections, have opted not to engage with this system in their endorsement process. So making single endorsements for candidates. We've seen a lot of the unions, at least thus far, still only choosing to endorse one candidate. More recently, I think we saw with the Working Families Party endorsement, this decision to make a ranked endorsement. I think it's really interesting and potentially very powerful because it then puts a real incentive for that coalition, the Working Families Party, along with those candidates, to be leading some of the education efforts. You can imagine that your mailbox is about to fill up with, Working Families Party flyers that have a ranked choice ballot, sort of on them, so they can make clear how they've made their endorsement, some education efforts along with that. I think we're going to learn a lot of lessons in this first citywide primary where we use ranked choice voting about the players that learned how to engage with it and how that served them, and the players that opted for kind of the traditional political playbook, and did that hurt or did that help them? We don't know yet, but if I had to wager, I would suspect that those that engaged with it, they're going to learn how to use it better in the future. Not necessarily that their candidates will win, but they're going to know more about what the advantages and disadvantages are than those that sort of opted to just take a hands-off approach.
I'm kind of waiting to see if a bunch of endorsers who came out with first endorsements a little later in the process wind up announcing maybe their second and third once they've thought about it a little more, or they get lobbied a little bit more by those candidates and campaigns. And that's what I was going to ask you next, Jeff. Are you getting a sense that candidates and campaigns are sort of saying to groups or important elected officials or interesting endorsers of different kinds, hey, I know I might not be your favorite, but give me a second choice endorsement? Is that part of the strategy yet, as far as you can tell?
I mean, we've had one endorsement where, a Bronx, I believe it was a state senator, assemblyman, I forget, made an endorsement, and he endorsed two candidates. He endorsed Scott Stringer and Diane Morales for mayor. So, that was an interesting prospect. It was weird though, because they were both there and they're like, well, we don't want to say who our second choices are, but you had this candidate, telling his constituents, and obviously, constituents might listen to what he has to say. These are the two people I'm looking at. So, I don't know. I think it remains to be seen. Like Brigid said, I think we're going to have to wait and see. You talk to people and they're still trying to figure it out. Some of the campaigns are still trying to figure out what their approach should be and what their strategy should be, because this is all so new. I mean, I think two things that I'm kind of looking at in this process is, one, does this help voter turnout? What we've seen so far in the special council elections is that the voter turnout has still been very low. I think on the March 23rd elections, you had like 11% turnout, and then the other election had like a 5% turnout. So, that's not helpful so far, but it was a special election. So we'll have to see how that changes. And then, there was also a sense that ranked choice was supposed to help change the tenor of campaigns, sort of eliminate negative campaigning. That hasn't necessarily been the case yet, at least on the mayoral level. There's been a lot of sniping. We expect, as the candidates, start going on TV with ads, there could be more sniping. And in addition to that, there's been an influx of money from super PACs and independent expenditure committees who can go negative without the candidates having to have any association with them. So I think those are two things I'm watching, two sort of results of how ranked choice voting will shape the election, which I think will have a good sense of, will help people how they determine how they feel about it as we move into the future.
I'll just quickly say on what Jeff was saying, one of the interesting things, at least on maybe spurring some more turnout or some more positive campaigning, is ranked choice voting undoubtedly sort of should motivate candidates to try to talk to almost every single voter that they're trying to get some kind of ranked vote from, even if they don't think they'll be their number one choice. So that's a good thing. All right, very good. I thank all three of you very much for joining us on this educational program about ranked choice voting. Everyone who is eligible should be getting ready to vote in June and take advantage of ranked choice voting. We will see you next time. I'm Ben Max. Thanks for watching.